My name is Alex Porter. I'm a mechanical engineer from Toronto, Canada. I'm 37 years old. In 2010, I lived an absolute nightmare. One that, if I could forget, I would certainly brush it into the recesses of my mind for eventual disposal over time. But, as I'm going to explain, this is now hardwired into my DNA. It's a curious tale. One that will make little sense unless you understand. No, unless you accept two things. Ancient folklore has basis in real bricks and mortar fact. And secondly, the events that occurred during the infamous Chernobyl disaster on Saturday, 26 April 1986, at the number 4 reactor in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, had some real, well-documented repercussions. Some that were not so well documented, but not difficult to imagine. There was never any voice to the clash of these two realities. I want to ensure that you know that this is my voice and my part in that reality. One that unfortunately can never be released from my current existence. Well, perhaps it's better if I explain this in some comprehensive chronology, if I can get through this completely. A piece-by-piece linear account may help. So, let's turn back the clock. See if I can paste together the occurrences that have led to my need to tell you what happened, and my fears for the future. In March of 2010, I received a random but welcome email from Kolesnik Heavy Equipment Company of Pripyat, Ukraine. The email had conveyed to me, in unsurprisingly horrendous English grammar and spelling, an opportunity for an experienced mechanical engineer to serve as a foreman in their Pripyat factory. A factory that churns out excavators, bulldozers, and small utility trucks and other seemingly budget-quality versions of construction equipment. If there were a John Deere or Mitsubishi of Ukraine, my research concluded that Kolesnik was about the third ranked in that particular market. The email went on to explain that because they had lost some of their better Russian engineers due to pressure from Kiev, political stuff that really seemed light years away from anything that I really understood or cared about. They needed someone to oversee production, and that, having seen my profile online, they were willing to offer me a decent salary, with the provision of accommodations and flights. The first flight, within the initial 3 weeks to meet and discuss the opportunity, and subsequently a flight back for the arrangement of that move. Obviously, I would have to secure my own accommodation, but the contract would ensure that they would cover the cost of my rent expenses while I was in their employment. My brother Aaron is a machinist and an MEP specialist, and he had also applied but wasn't as fortunate. Or unfortunate, as you will come to know. I really wanted Aaron with me. I thought it would be a great experience to have my brother with me. Sadly, we would be apart and rely on visits with one another. The company had a decent vacation compensation that included 1 flight home per year. Fair, I deemed. I was recently furloughed from my job in Barrie, Ontario, and, admittedly, a role that was quite beneath me, but a salary is a salary. Unfortunately, due to the strain of the recent downturn at the time, they were having trouble continuing to make a go of it, and customers were just not buying like they used to. It was motor parts, and nothing that compared to oversight on the output of heavy equipment products, so this was a great opportunity, I felt. Certainly something that looked to provide the much-needed optics on my CV that showed I was really punching above my weight with this new senior title. After a lot of thought and a few conversations with the general manager, Alexander, I accepted. It took me 2 weeks to get my affairs in order at home and sell my car, empty my little house into partial storage, sell some items that I'd been looking to get rid of for a while, and gave some other items away. Then I packed up, and I boarded a flight departing for Kiev Boryspil International Airport from Toronto. A long flight made longer due to my inability to sleep from nervousness and, to be honest, a bit of stress. I'd need to make a stopover in Iceland, but a short one. This was life-changing. Moving to the other side of the world was a bit overwhelming. I spent much of the flight reading about the area and extended region, while practicing a bit of Russian and Ukrainian common phrases. The desire to learn and the actual practical learning were chalk and cheese, I'm afraid. I got suddenly preoccupied by the Chernobyl story. I had completely forgotten that this was very close to the nuclear meltdown that emptied the area and was just beginning to resurface as a habitable area. The book that I brought was an overview of Ukraine and its recent history. In addition, a few printed pages of interesting key facts about the area I was set to call home. For at least a while. The Chernobyl reactor accident and the chaos that it caused really was quite disturbing, at least to one Canadian boy. The worst accident we've ever really had was the Halifax explosion disaster near the turn of the 20th century, when a munitions ship collided with another in the harbor and destroyed the entire town and heard hundreds of miles away. This nuclear reactor situation spun out tales of mutated animals and, of course, humans. Bizarre, but this was a very long time ago, over 2 decades, and it was set to reopen to the public in that year for the first time. The year that I set wheels down. Hopefully, among the mess would be a few cute Ukrainian girls. Come on, Eastern Europe were famous for their beautiful ladies. Hopefully this Western boy was going to be alluring, some exotic piece of North American ass. The thought always made me laugh out loud. I touched down in the late afternoon to this microscopic airport and was met with a misspelled sign bearing something that resembled my name, but clearly only could be me. Well, I guess I could also be Olex Potter. I would hate to think this person existed on my flight and I took their ride. Oh well. Sorry, Olex. Or is it Vybacht? Something like that. I was taken directly to the office of Kolesnik Heavy Equipment Company in Pripyat. It took about 2 hours or more. Along the way, dead forest and more dead forest. Seemed that winter lasted much longer because the foliage just didn't want to make a return in this part of the world. Give it time, I thought. It's still just early April now. We aren't that tropical in Canada to have foliage elitism. I was met by Fedor Borisko, Human Resources Director, for a bit of a welcome that involved a cup of tea, some biscuits, introduction to the company and some brochures about the group. All in Ukrainian, or what was it, Russian? I don't know the difference, linguistically, if I'm being honest. Fedor instructed me to take the next 4 days to finalize my accommodation, orient myself and get situated. He also mentioned that I should not venture far at night because of reports of some rabid raccoons that have not yet all been snatched up. When still in Toronto, I had researched a few available properties online in Pripyat. The accommodation allocation of my salary was fair, but I didn't move to the middle of nowhere to spend all my money on a posh pad and leave with nothing. The positive was that there were no posh pads in Pripyat, so the choice to save the big money was made for me. I got in touch with a small local property management group that was very helpful in identifying the right spot. Ultimately, I was helped to lease a ground floor apartment in a basic-looking, super square and dull 4-story apartment building just outside of Pripyat, close to the Red Forest. A dense forest bordering Pripyat and Chernobyl, the same dead forest that I will now have the pleasure of having as my vista for the time being. I'm certain that given time it will be a beautiful green view, if, of course, summer ever makes its way to this place. It wasn't long afterwards that I'd find out that this forest was perpetually dead due to radioactive contamination. But there seemed to be sparks of green that arrive in the summer, but not much, I was told. A week later, I was starting my first shift at the Kolesnik Heavy Equipment Company, after moving into my little 2-bedroom apartment and spending the remaining weekend exploring the smallest and most depressing neighborhood imaginable. Churches, butcher shops, and not much else. The meet and greet tour was nice enough, I suppose. Not much English, but they tried, often mistaking me for American stereotypes and George Bush, yes, New York Yankees shouts. Not sure what that was about, but they were at least vocal and not at all the silent, moody types that I had come to familiarize myself with through Western media. Seemed mostly a good bunch of guys. Probably wanted to make their new boss happy, I guess. Work remained okay. Most of the applications they used were antiquated but usable and in English, which was good. After a couple of months, I had gotten used to my surroundings. They grew bleaker every day, but I got used to them. I had become numb to the grayness and dilapidated infrastructure around me. I was making a good living and the job seemed fairly fluid and not difficult. My new Ukrainian work buddy, Andrei, had decided to take me to a local bar in some Soviet hazing attempt. I understood, but really just an innocent drunken induction. I'm a decent-sized guy, normal size and weight, but I've had my share of bar mix-ups and scuffles, most of which resulted in far less bruises and cuts to me than my wobbly opponent, but was just worried about standing out and being a bit of a bullseye to some giant Slavic Viking type that eats pit bulls for breakfast and picks his teeth with the bones of smaller Western guys in pressed shirts. None of that was really part of the reality that I experienced. There was a little karaoke jam going on, little groups of people just having their drinks and unwinding. It was totally fine. In fact, I felt so relieved that there was actually a watering hole just a 25-minute walk from home. Not close, but since I refused to drive while drunk, unlike some of the other patrons I observed, I was okay with the distance. If the air had returned to normal, as was suggested, it was okay for a nice crisp walk home. Andrei decided to talk to some group of girls at the bar, one of which he recognized. I was simply at the point where being tired, a bit drunk, and not speaking any of the local language might be just too much for me at that time. I decided to call it a night. I explained to Andrei that I was going to leave and go home and get some sleep.
But my friend, tomorrow no work. It's time for party. Look, girls like American boys.
He shouted drunkenly across the bar, drowning out the music, amazingly. He caught himself from a quick stumble and potentially embarrassing fall.
Andrei, I'm not American.
I shouted and gave him a smile and thumbs up.
Anyway, hey, thank you for a great night, but I go sleep now.
I proclaimed as distinctly as I could in beginner's English while trying to make a sleeping, charade-like gesture, cupping my hands under my cheek in a tipped head motion.
Okay. Leave party to real men, not little American boys.
Andrei laughed.
Andrei, I am not American. Oh.
With a deep exhale.
Never mind.
I refuted while quickly losing steam in my argument and losing interest in the conversation. Could my jet lag be taking a month to diffuse? I was just at the end of a long week. We had a new product line of hydraulic lifts set to be introduced that required late-night team briefings, and with the translation just for me and a couple other expat team members, they always extended the meetings, which extended the days overall, mostly involving how to use budget-level shit-quality materials and the reduction of labor overhead to ensure that we build something that will probably blow up or fall apart on first use. Well, a job is a job. I grabbed my black leather jacket from my chair, something that I discovered is a rare commodity and one that I received unscrupulous offers for during the evening. I was lucky to be leaving with it, but kept my eye on it all night just in case one of those declined offers got a bit light-fingered and quick-motored. I said goodbye to Andrei, but as expected, he was completely non-responsive while engaging in his cartoonish leering at the group of girls he was ready to unleash himself upon, with bad lines and a bit of salivating, I would wager. Some guys really need to see themselves in their behavior. I suspect Andrei wouldn't care the next day. Setting out into the night, I programmed my mental GPS, and using the little landmarks that I had gotten used to, I just knew I would ping myself along a pretty accurate path while watching the churches and electronic shops, butchers, and factories along the forest area that I became slightly accustomed to. At least I knew the direction, and the forest line was a good trajectory for me. It was cold. Man, it got really cold in the evenings. Must have dropped by double digits when the sun went down, and then even colder after midnight. This was something I was used to in Canada. Cold doesn't bother me. I never enjoyed it, but I was used to it. What I wasn't used to was the absolute silence. I know the birds and other critters were sleeping, but it was completely muted and noiseless. Until I came across a long structure. It was one of those old two-leveled warehouses that was devoid of character, with a concrete wall surrounding it. The barricade-like surrounding wall of the warehouse had occasional gaps, and that's where I heard a shuffling noise, accompanied by a kind of moaning, grunting sound, like a pig, but I knew that there were no pigs running around. I wanted to ignore it, but in stunning silence that existed outside of this noise, there was no way, given the contrast it provided. Then I saw it. It pains me to state that it was hard to describe and even harder to conceive of physically, but the cliché is the only way I can put this forward. Between the wall opening, moving alongside the inner part of the wall, I saw it move across one of the open wall gaps meant for car entry. A person or something that had perhaps a mask, but something that made it look like its head was 3 times bigger than any head should be in relation to its body. The head looked to be sagged slightly to one side, had a bit of dark hair on its head. His head. Its head. I don't know. The forehead, and it was so dark at the time, this is all I could observe, was bulged out, as was its glossy, huge eyes. This was a side view, and its mouth bulged also, beyond the only inset bit where its nose was meant to be. Just what looked like holes in its nose area made its teeth even more pronounced. It had enormous pegs for teeth, it seemed. The bottom part of the mouth, the jaw, pushed out further. Its entire head, being disproportionately massive, seemed to slope outwards from forehead to jaw. I was stunned to silence. I stopped walking, and I was afraid to even move. Its arms were ropey and long, seemingly sinewy, but its arms extended to ankle level, where it ended with long, creepy-ass fingers. These extra long fingers were curled under, just above the ground surface. It was grotesque. If this were not a small, empty, cold, dark, humorless and forest-encased village, I would think that someone was playing a prank or perhaps on their way to a costume party. I knew this not to be true. My common sense was battling with my imagination that this was real. It was walking in a bit of a bounce while grunting in an almost pained way. Half gorilla, half hippo, 100% deformed. It was when the thing had passed by the gap of the wall and out of sight, and I, still frozen in complete disbelief, did my mobile phone ring. It was loud into the night. A stark contrasted screeching into the void of the empty, cold, barren landscape I currently inhabited, and I scrambled to contain it as quickly as possible, wresting it from my pocket and fumbling with it, nearly dropping it until I was able to secure it with my hand, staring at the brightly lit screen that added to one more unnecessary sensory element in the calm darkness that once existed. I could see that it was Andre. I fumbled to answer.
Hello, Andre.
I quickly responded in a panicked, whispered voice.
Cowboy,
I can't talk right
come
now.
back. Girl likes you. Won't you come back for a drink?
He spoke over me into my surrounding darkness that required no speaker option. I hung up quickly, hoping that Andre would understand. I would blame it later on a bad connection. Putting my phone on silent immediately, I shoved it back into my pocket. I looked back to the only sight that mattered at that moment, the empty gap of the wall that was no longer empty. The thing was back in view, half behind the wall and half peeking out, but standing straight in my direction, staring directly at me. This was obvious. The one thing in this world that I now wanted to be completely invisible to, anonymous to. The ring put me on its radar.
Thanks, Andre, you drunken rusky asshole.
I angrily sighed between gritted teeth. It let out a muted rattle that I soon interpreted to be a growl, followed by a terrifying sort of grin. that stretched across the length of its massively wide face, displaying those crooked, giant, peg-like teeth. Then stopped smirking, and with buggy eyes that looked in 2 different directions, formed a scowl and started moving towards me with a speed that I did not expect. This thing was moving fast. Most horridly were those Neanderthal-like arms at full stretch as it was moving. If I weren't heart-stoppingly alarmed, looking back, I would have explained it mimicking a bird in a mating dance. I felt my chest was going to burst. I tore off as fast as I could. I can't even remember if I went in the right direction or not at that time. I just ran in the opposite direction of this aberration that was intent on catching up with me. What did I do to attract it? Why did it want to chase me? How did it move with those long, weighty arms, those trunk-like legs and massive head? I just wanted to be out of there. I think I got 6 blocks before my lungs ran out of gas. I couldn't even control the sound of my gasping, as to do so would probably cause me to pass out. As soon as I could stop breathing for a moment to just listen, I heard the low moans in the distance behind me. I couldn't gauge for the life of me the distance. I had no clue how far behind, but I had to recuperate as quickly as possible to lose this thing and get to my apartment beyond locked doors. Through shadowy roads, behind homes, through gardens and back alleys, to avoid clear sight. I finally made it to my apartment. I rushed in, quietly locking all doors, making certain that no light was turned on, as it would surely attract attention in a building of completely pitch-black windows. It was late, and the only awake beasts in this night, to my knowledge, were myself and this unimaginable creature. I tossed and turned. I slept intermittently some, but mostly stared into the dark. I knew I was safe, or I think I was safe, but it was a knee-jerk reaction for me at that time to just contemplate the void. The darkness was swimming with monsters. I finally succumbed to the fatigue and the cheap vodka and passed out. Can't say that my dreams were better, as my nightmares abounded. I awoke numerous times in a sweat. I swear that at least one of those times, I heard the thing moaning in the distance outside in the night. I had hoped that when I finally woke, it would all be the result of a tough, tiring work week, followed by some bad food and even worse alcohol. The following day, I felt it difficult to make a decision to leave the house, so I read part of a book, made some macaroni and cheese, and stared outside into a sunlit but gray forest wall and into the empty and dead yards of my sparsely spaced-out neighbors' homes. Around 4 p.m., I received a call from Andre, who seemed to not remember me saying goodbye and left after vomiting on one of his hopeful female acquisitions. He said that at the time he found it funny, and then got into his car and somehow found his way home. Around 7 p.m., I decided to play a bit of Resident Evil on my old PS3 to keep my mind occupied. It did the trick for a while, despite the game's creepiness, but I gave up and decided that I'd get into bed early. I was so tired from such little sleep the night before. The dreamlike events of the prior evening were beginning to seem more and more like fantasy, and I was beginning to disperse it from my mind. I tossed and turned for close to 2 hours, while cats hissed at each other outside, intermittently, while clanging around the sides of my exterior walls. Very weird, sustained hissing. Strange for cats. They seemed to have called a truce because by around 10:30 p.m. the night became silent. Then, it was just long, piercing howls, far into the distance. Dogs? I don't know. I passed out eventually. I don't know when it happened. I can only guess that it was just after midnight. I was sleeping, finally, peacefully and uninterrupted, until I was interrupted. A scraping sound, loud enough to wake me, like a scraping against the side of my building, and various objects on the ground being banged around like twigs crunching and cans kicked. Then, the moaning, with intermittent grunts. It all came back, and it seemed to slowly get louder with the increasing proximity. Like that night never left. I was chanting to myself, under my breath, to please let this be a trick of the wind, or the trees, or perhaps I was still sleeping and this was some remnant of the prior night. I mean, how could this be happening? How could this thing be back and be here at my home? Why did I choose a ground-level apartment? Why was I so cheap to choose this shitty unsecured ground-level flat? I knew this sound. I wasn't wrong. My bedroom was pitch dark, with only the light of the yellowed, dim overhead parking lights showing through the openings of my curtains. They were non-existent, mostly with the moon providing some additional luminescence. Curtains that were maybe 1 foot apart at best. These sounds, these moans, grunts, scraping, shuffling. They were close. Really close. This thing was here. Nearly in my room, it sounded.
Please, go away. Please, just go away.
I wished to myself. I was then terrified of my phone going off. Was it full volume again? I mean, it would be. Why wouldn't it be? I had calls today. I remember the ringer was on. What if a call comes in? I can't open my phone to check or change settings, or that light will definitely glow up this darkened room. Jesus Christ, what if I sneeze? I ran through multiple rapid-fire mental scenarios. As that sound got to my bedroom window.
How does it know where I am? How could it have known where I lived?
I whispered quietly. Is it a coincidence? Is it real? A trick? Maybe Andre is playing some sort of weird welcome gag they all do for the new expats. As I half buried my head, in complete stillness in my bed, a shadow began to move across my curtains, silhouetted against the moonlight. The moan got lower and was replaced with what sounded like a sinister hissing.
What the absolute fuck is happening right now? Please let it be a joke. I'll act terrified. And Andre will have won. I'll admit defeat, and he got me. He completely won this one.
I wasn't even making sense. Not even to myself. I was nearly fainting. I was feeling dizzy. This can't be real. The silhouette moved across, and there it was. Bulging eyes, the size of baseballs, reflecting and glistening as the moonlight touched them. This thing was as I remembered, but much, much closer. More definition. Much more terrifying. Its massive head was in between the curtain openings. It was easily close to 7 feet tall. The sounds that it made were even more sinister through the glass. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It had a grin, like it was satisfied with something newly sighted. Its eyes were bright, but only one seemed to move, completely independent of the other. Stationary, it seemed. The one that seemed to be unmoving was staring directly at me. How could it, though? I was in the dark. Absolute darkness, but the moonlight. Was it revealing me? Could it see me? With the assistance of the moon, I had a better view of it than it could possibly have of me. Its head was at the top of the window frame, clarifying that it was nearly 7 feet tall, broad shoulders, biceps visible, shirtless as it was the prior meeting. I waited, breathed covertly, uncomfortably restrained breathing. Each breath was so labored that it made me feel more and more suffocated. If Aaron were here, he would banshee scream at it with a baseball bat. He was always more courageous than me since we were kids. The staring eye seemed to grow even more intently, like it was slowly becoming conscious of me, now seemingly beginning to recognize what it was seeing, when it hadn't just before. Almost like it was adapting to this wisp of moonlight, the only thing we shared. Maybe this thing could see in the dark. I had no idea of knowing. This face was not even remotely human. This was ghoulish, surreal. It shifted forward slightly, almost like it was attempting to position itself better for viewing me. I could not see the gaze of the other eye, but I felt like it was looking elsewhere. This thing was breathing heavy. The window was becoming fogged from its breathing on the outside of the window pane. Then, repulsively, its wide mouth opened, revealing a grayish tongue that began to slowly lap up the fog on the outside of the window. I know that it was trying to ensure that it could see. This was obvious to me. I slowly moved off the bed, little by little, making certain that I couldn't be seen. I slowly slithered off to the other side of the bed onto the floor, nearly motionless. Terrified, I made it. I couldn't see the window any longer from my point of view. This was a good thing, but also a very bad thing. Perhaps it was better to have my predator in view than somewhere new. I didn't know what it was doing. I shifted my gaze above the bed incredibly slowly, and it was gone. No sound. Nothing. It just disappeared. All that was left was a sticky, slimy, wide trail of that mutant saliva where the window was licked. I slept on the floor for the rest of the night. I managed to retrieve one pillow, but that was the extent of my courage. The following few nights there was nothing. The curtains were pulled tight. I even placed a string tied to empty cans outside my window on twigs sticking out of the ground as some sort of early warning system, should this happen again. They were gone the night I arrived home from the next day at work. Perhaps a cat or dog destroyed my little trap. I don't know. Its face embedded in my mind. Those hippo-like teeth and giant mouth. I guess psychosomatically I just referred to it as a human hippo when I thought of it. A shame because I actually liked hippos. But its stretched out plasticine-like nose and bulbous wide mouth with its peg-like hippo teeth. There was no other reference my mind could synthesize. Wolves howled in the distance. This was a familiar yet somehow innocuous sound I paid little attention to. I felt that it was important, that I wasn't going crazy, and I knew that this was real, that it was real. I had to find out what it was, and if anyone had answers, that it existed to others. There was no way that something like this could be tangible and not a trick of my stress. And how could it lurk within a small village and go unnoticed? I first asked Andre, as the most obvious person and my closest friend, and I guess confidant in Pripyat.
Oh, Alex. I think you spend more vodka than cheap Serbian poison you're drinking.
Andre seemed to mock.
I'm being serious, Andre. Does any of this sound familiar? I'm terrified to go out at night. You must have heard something. You know something. Anything.
I angrily and desperately replied.
Look, this is strange place. Strange things happen here in past, and things changed after Chernobyl accident. Wolf mutate, the monster, kill pets and some children that play in the Red Forest. Some people change and born as monsters. They do not last. Most die after children, no adult, because sickness make die early.
Andre explained. This makes sense. Was this thing a mutated human?
How does anyone not see this or not in the news?
I responded.
Alex, if you say you see what you see, this is strange for you. And for many, but not strange here. Cannot explain this, because I told many times before. They die Long time ago.
Andre explained in his almost laughably broken English.
Wait. What do you mean, died a long time ago? What does that mean? What is this person? Who are they? Many years after accident, people, babies, grow into monsters. Not just in head, brain change. Not human anymore. Real monsters. Broken people. Old secret, but many take broken people into Red Forest in cages and made killed by gun. Sad, but all hidden by killing, so no more problem. Problem goes. What you see now, not possible. Unless what?
I quickly interrupted. Andre continued.
Unless some live on and if survive. Many, and if true, explain why you see in night. But better you keep to self. Not tell everyone. That's better.
He seemed to take a serious tone in this warning. I didn't feel comfortable asking questions of anyone else. What would they think of me? Either I was crazy, and if they knew what I said to be true, I don't know how they now would feel about someone knowing about their secret. I also didn't feel comfortable alarming those that didn't know to perhaps go hunting. I just needed to find a way to rid this mutant stalker from my life. But how could I just pick up and move after just over 1 month? And I can't just quit this job and go home. I was happy to return home, but I planned on at least a couple of years of saving this salary to have something worth going home with. I was drawing a blank. Just wait it out? See if it goes away. I had little choice in the short term. Night was drawing near. I needed this job. We experienced an incident-free evening. Cats close, wolves far, and never-ending visceral dreams. Dreams of goblins snatching up children, and picking bones with dangly fingers and crushing skulls with giant powerful maws. Sleep occurred nonetheless, despite the intense content within the pieces of sleep. Rest came and the morning was a relief. I knew monsters existed. I saw this thing with my own eyes, so forever there will never be rest knowing that even if this thing one day expired, it did exist. They do exist. For now, I was somewhat rested, and that was a small battle won. No thanks to my new creepy friend.